Thank you, Brenda, and I'd like to thank the library and their staff for their collaboration with the Jacob Leisler Institute in our lecture series. And I'd also like to thank the generous support of the Dyke Family Association so that we are able to uh, produce these lectures. Of all the dangers colonial seamen feared most, capture by North African pirates was the greatest. Slavery is conventionally presented as a one-way traffic in human beings from Africa to the Americas, but early modern Europeans also shared the fate of being carried off as slaves. The institution of black chattel slavery and its lasting legacy in New York is an ugly but very real component of our region's history. Through its research, the Jacob Leisler Institute is committed to presenting information about all the diverse inhabitants of colonial New York. This presentation, however, is not a commentary on slavery, nor a comparison of its practice by various nations, and recognizes that the situation described here differs from the system that brutalized those of African descent in New York for generations. Rather, it is about a single historical event and how that event changed colonial New York's political life. Nonetheless, some of this background is necessary. North African raids for European slaves reached a peak between the 16th and 18th centuries, when, as a part of the Ottoman Empire, Barbary raiders captured an estimated 1.25 million men, women, and children for the slave markets of Algiers, Morocco, Tunis, and Tripoli. Indeed, between 1674 and 1680, some 350 English vessels fell into their hands. Among these was the Susannah, owned by wealthy New York City merchant Jacob Leisler. The captivity of the Susannah is a dramatic event that reveals how closely 17th century New York was tied to the international mercantile world. The Susannah's venture was not an ordinary business venture. Voyage was not an ordinary business venture for the 37-year-old Leisler. It was also planned to introduce to the Atlantic community the newly formed company those 25 and 23-year-old stepsons, Cornelis and Timothy Vanderveen. Both were his wife's sons by a previous marriage to the late Peter Cornelis Vanderveen. The trip would be made in a sleek new pink built together with masts, yards, and longboat in the fall of 1676 by John Leggett of Westchester. Leisler named the ship Susannah for his 12-year-old daughter. Serving as the ship's captain was Leisler's stepson, Timothy, while elder stepson Cornelis served as a second mate. By February, Leisler had assembled a crew consisting of Goose Stevenson, Jan Peek, Herman Swain, Jan Philipson, Jan Seekin, Jan Garten, and Cornelis Berg. With the addition of his stepsons and his wife's cousin, Lucas Kierstede, who was learning the merchant's craft from Leisler, the crew came to 8 men, all in their early 20s. Leisler then acquired the appropriate paperwork for the voyage, certificates for himself and the crew as inhabitants and free denizens of New York City, and a separate passport for Susannah. These passports were essential for the crew's subsequent fate. The Susannah sailed for St. Mary's, Maryland in late April, where slaves filled the ship's hold for local planters with 44,000 pounds of tobacco and 131 untreated cowhides. On May 12th, tobacco planter Mark Gordia sent a 98-pound sterling bill of exchange for goods received from Leisler to be placed into the London account of Henri Couturier. Couturier, an old friend of Leisler's and former brother-in-law of Leisler's wife, is best known today as the painter of New Netherland director Petrus Stuyvesant's portrait. Dover port books record the Susannah as being in England on July 4th, where most of the tobacco was unloaded. 2 days later, on July 6th, the Susannah cleared for Amsterdam, carrying 16,631 pounds of tobacco and 200 net old brass for Leisler, and 810 pounds of tobacco for Timothy van der Veen and Company. In the mid-1670s, the Ottoman Empire was at the peak of its power under Sultan Mehmed IV and was expanding into Christian territories. The empire's North African Barbary states of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli had for generations conducted raids for slaves and loot along Europe's Mediterranean, Atlantic, and North Sea coasts. To focus resources on its wars of conquest in the Eastern Mediterranean and Balkans, the Sultan's North African governor, Baba Hassan, had ordered Algerian Admiral Ali Reis Canary not to commit hostilities against English ships under a treaty negotiated in 1671. Nonetheless, Algerians continued to take English ships found without passes, alleging their belief that was His Majesty's desire that they should do so. Deteriorating relations with the Barbary states and the outbreak of war with Tangiers in May 1677 caused England to send a fleet to North Africa under the command of Sir John Narborough. Learning of Narborough's fleet, the elderly Dey of Algiers, Ismail Pasha, decreed to make prize of the Englishmen's goods. On October 8, 1677, Admiral Canary's raiders captured Leisler Susannah in the turbulent waters of the English Channel. Undoubtedly, the fierce corsairs easily overtook the unseasoned and poorly armed Susannah's crew without a fight. A first-hand description of an episode a century later gives an idea of the terrifying event. We saw several men jump up upon her poop to haul aft the main sheet, and saw by their dress and long beards they were Moors or Algerines. We heard a most terrible shouting, clapping of hands, huzzaing, etc., and saw a great number of men rise with their heads above the gunwale, dressed in Turkish habit, all armed with scimitars and pistols, others with pikes, spears, lances, and knives. As soon as they came on board our vessel, they made signs for all of us to go forward, assuring us in several languages that if we did not obey their commands, they would immediately massacre us all. They then went below, broke open all the trunks and chests, and plundered every movable article that did not consist of a cargo or furniture. They then came on deck like a pack of ravenous wolves and stripped the clothes off our backs. The confused and terrified prisoners, shackled and wearing nothing except a piece of shirt and a pair of drawers, were carried to Algiers with a Susannah in tow. In Algiers, the cargo was placed in warehouses for sale, and the captives were paraded for an inspection in order to determine their monetary value as slaves for ransom. Particular attention was paid to the teeth, skin, hands, and nails, which in the early modern era revealed much about social status. The upper classes, for example, avoided physical work and sunlight, so their skin was pale and smooth and their hands uncalloused. Moreover, they consumed a diet considerably different than that of the laborer or the common sailor, whose table of coarsely brown grain products wore down the teeth. Contemporary accounts reveal that Jacob Leisler dressed fashionably. He wore a wig, carried a walking stick, and was one of the few New Yorkers who maintained a tailor in men and women's clothing in his household. The Barbary rate in English money for a captive at that time was 40 pounds sterling, payment of which was demanded in silver coinage known as pieces of 8. Leisler's inspection caused the Algerines to believe they had captured a valuable prize. They set his ransom at 2,050 pieces of 8, or 410 pounds sterling. This was extravagant. The ransom demanded at the same time for the captured governor of Carolina Sothel was set at 375 pounds sterling. The inspections of the others also resulted in a higher rate. Leisler's stepsons, Cornelis and Timothy van der Veen, were valued at 175 pounds each. Hugh Stevenson at 170, Lucas Kierspader at 150, Jan Philipson, Jan Seeken, and Jan Peek at 100 pounds each, and Jan Garden and Cornelis Berg at 90 pounds each, for a total of 1,050 pounds. Herman Swain apparently had died. Adding the crew and Leisler's ransoms together, the sum demanded amounted to the large figure of 2,280 pounds sterling. Yet, between 1674 and 1682, England lacked a treaty with Algiers that would have provided a conduit for redemption. On October 13th, English consul in Algiers, Samuel Martin, noted, "All the people that belongs to the English ships in port are sent to my house and live at my charge, being 36 persons, who eat me more bread in a day than the benefit of my employment hath afforded me in a year." But Leisler and his crew were now at the mercy of rapidly deteriorating Anglo-Algerine relations. Several days later, Martin and his family narrowly escaped from being murdered by mobs. His house was seized and the public assembled a general court, before which he wrote, "I was called with much rage and fury. Some were for killing me, others to put me in chains." The captured English vessels were destroyed, including the Susannah. The New Yorkers were separated, the more valuable chained in pits in the publicly owned Bagno's former bathhouses, the less valuable put to work on public projects. The prisoners' situation moderated in February 1678, when fear of an attack by the army of Fez, present-day Morocco, caused the Dey to consider negotiating for peace with England. I have of late found better treatment than formerly from the people here in general," Martin wrote, "though to my great charge and expense, and it is now small comfort to our people in captivity that I am sometimes capable to assist them, which I do to the utmost of my ability." On March 3rd, he wrote to English Home Secretary Joseph Williamson that he had procured the liberty of some English captives, but the Algerines would not permit them to leave. He added, however, "I lately understood from the Dey and governor that they would be ready to give satisfaction for the Susannah, and what other damage has become done to any of our merchant ships with the indented passports." Shortly thereafter, in March, Leisler was released, for on April 13th, Martin complained he had been removed to a more strict confinement and enjoyed no other liberty than a condemned criminal. By that date, plague had broken out in the city, and the situation of Leisler's crew was reduced to torture and starvation. Leisler, meanwhile, sailed with Martin's letter packets to Marseille, and from there to London. In London, he attempted to clear his ransom debt. He later wrote Charles Calvert, 3rd Lord Baltimore, they had been lately taken by the Turks, but when he came for England, he expected some produce of that tobacco, but found himself in debt thereby. Leisler probably also contacted Secretary of the Admiralty Samuel Pepys, to whom Martin's letter seeking reimbursement for laying out ransoms was addressed. At this time, Pepys was involved in the case of the Quaker Merchant, another vessel captured by the Algerines. Involved in this affair was Pepys' spy, Jacob Milborne, who was connected with Leisler in New York and later became his son-in-law. While Leisler was in London, an Anglican clergyman named Titus Oates co-authored a lengthy tract accusing Roman Catholics of conspiring to assassinate King Charles II and seize the government. Oates' accusations of a popish plot kept broadening until eventually Pepys' name appeared among the accused. Among the supporters The impact of the so-called Popish plot on Calvinist Leisler is unclear, but among its supporters was Anthony Ashley Cooper, first Earl of Shaftesbury and Lord Proprietor of South Carolina, who Leisler is said to have greatly admired and who may have also played a role in aiding Leisler's redemption. New Yorkers first learned of the capture and release in July 1678. On July 23rd, Elsie Leisler petitioned that a legal suit be delayed until she heard from her husband, whom she noted was taken by the Turks and ransomed and expected shortly. On the following August 17th, Governor Edmund Andros presented to the council a letter that he received from one John Nesbitt, but no date from whence it came, relating to the ransom of Leisler, his two sons, and the others, noting that Leisler pays his own part. Reading this representation of the desolate condition of certain persons belonging to and subjects of this government who were taken by the Turks in Mr. Leisler's smack and are in slavery in Algiers, Andros ordered church officers throughout the colony to collect benevolences of well-disposed persons for the captain's redemption. Churches handling public subscriptions for disaster relief was an efficient and common practice in the early modern era. The New York City Reformed Consistory still retains the detailed correspondence relating to the Algerine captain's redemption. By September 1678, New York City Church had received pledges for funds and cash for such commodities as furs and grain from most of the provinces of the communities. Particularly touching are the desperate efforts of the poor crewmen's families to come up with a share. Manhattan tenant farmer Dirk Seeken, for example, mortgaged 100 guilders worth of goods toward the redemption of his son. On September 24th, New York City Reformed Minister Wilhelmus Neuenhausen and the Reformed Dutch Church elders wrote to Leisler's Amsterdam business agents, Cornelis Jacobs Moy and Cornelis Starval, that we, by order of the Herr Governor, have completed a collection with the good inhabitants for releasing of several persons who, with the kidnapped pink Susannah, owned by Jacob Leisler, have been brought into miserable slavery in Algiers. They then added the funds would be sent by the next ship. In early October, the church consistory sent Moy and Darvall aboard the ship Blossom 204 beaver pelts, 8 threelings, 13 halves, 33 pieces, 26 otters, 7 fishers, 2 minks, 14 raccoons, 4 cats, 2 foxes, and 1 wolf for the release of the slaves in Turkey. The following week, they added to the shipment another cask of beavers, bills of exchange totaling 5,000 guilders, and a letter requesting diligence to be employed toward the releasing of Stevenson, Pake, Phillipson, and Seeken. Darvall and Moy responded to the New York letters on March 10th. We work diligently to comply with your request to execute the release of the prisoners at Algiers, they wrote, for which purpose we have made every effort to use such means as we deemed expedient, and have placed here as Cornelis Van Goor the order to instruct via his correspondent in Livorno, Italy, his friend in Algiers, to release the same at the lowest price and as quickly as possible. They added that all the bills of exchange have been paid, failing 265 guilders short, and that the casks of beavers and pelts were being sold in London, not doubting that they will yield more there than here, reflecting declining demand for pelts in Europe with the changes in fashion. Slavery was illegal within the Dutch Republic, but Livorno, Italy, better known in English as Leghorn, had developed a large slave trade in Muslims captured for other Christian nations. As a result, Livorno's mercantile community often served as intermediaries in the exchange of slaves held by the nations of the two competing faiths. Agency was usually effected through the Italian and North African Jewish communities, which maintained close ties and were neutral in the disputes between Christian and Muslim. Livorno bankers did a brisk business in changing European currencies into the silver pieces of eight demanded as ransom by the Ottoman states. From Dorvel and Moore's letters, we learned that Cornelis van Goor, a wealthy Amsterdam merchant in the Italian and Middle East trade, initially undertook the relief efforts, but then delegated them to his nephew Adriano. The Van Goors transferred the funds to Livorno through the family connections of Amsterdam Jewish physician Moshe Raphael Salam. Salam was a son of Louis de Azevedo, who at this time was the Dutch Republic's resident in Algiers. On May 4th, 1679, they noted that Van Goor's correspondent at Livorno had ordered the sum sent to Algiers for releasing the poor prisoners out of the lands of slavery and quickly set them free. Meanwhile, Leisler's captivity had future political implications for New York. Shortly after he sailed in May 1677, his mother-in-law, Maricha Jantz, widow of one of New York's wealthiest citizens, Hubert Lokermans, wrote her last will. Leaving her estate to her three natural children, she ignored her Lokerman's stepchildren and heirs. Leisler's fate was still unknown in January 1678, when Olaf van Cortlandt wrote his daughter, Maria van Rensselaer, "Your Aunt Maria Lokermans died the 17th of November, and your Frau stays in her mother's house until your cousin, Jacob Lokermans, comes home, or her husband, who is expected daily." The disposal of Maricha Jantz's estate became more complicated when Elsie Leisler's half-brother, Cornelis Sturkson, suddenly died in April. With the province's wealthiest woman, Maricha Jantz, and her son and heir, Cornelis, dead, and the fates of her son-in-law, two grandsons, and nephew unknown, an enormous property came into question. Indeed, the combined holdings of Durkinson, Lokermans, and Leisler took up a substantial portion of Manhattan's valuable East River waterfront. The fate of these properties was now in the hands of courts interpreting conflicting Dutch and English laws of inheritance. As historian Firth Abel notes, the resulting legal battle for control over the Lokermans' children became another shot fired in the long simmering feud between Maricha's natural-born children and her stepchildren. The first record of Leisler being back on Manhattan is not until February 1679. During the following months, he aggressively set about collecting debts owed him to recoup the losses incurred by his captivity and securing his wife's inheritance. On June 16, 1679, Moy and Dorvel fully compensated Adriano van Goor for his payment through Moisey Solom for the ransom of Pake, Philipson, Stevenson, and Cornelis and Timothy Vanderveen. The following day, Elsha Winters accepted Van Goor's bill exchange as a debt and paid for Lucas Kierstader's ransom. Van Goor had previously received 1,000 guilders cash from Elsha to be subtracted from Kierstader's ransom with the express condition that if Kierstader was not brought into Christian territory or had converted to the Turkish faith, the money had to be returned. Van Goor further declared on June 17th that he had received 2,500 guilders in Amsterdam bank credit and 1,500 guilders cash from Cornelis Dorvel toward the ransom and expenses of Pake, Philipson, Stevenson, and Timothy Vanderveen, with the same conditions relating to death or conversion. 2 days later, Moy and Dorvel wrote to the New York Consistory that Van Goor's correspondent at Livorno had finally arranged an agreement for Algiers for freeing the poor prisoners out of the chains of slavery as quickly as they can. Negotiations were undoubtedly aided when, on July 28th, the Dutch Republic ratified a treaty with Algiers. On August 29th, Moy and Dorval wrote, "We have paid most of the fee for the release of the slaves into the hands of Monsieur Adriano Van Goor, so that with the next mail, we hope to hear that not only the poor prisoners will have been released, but also they will have arrived in Christian territory." Meanwhile, the Algerines increased the sums demanded for the captain's release, delaying the ransom efforts. It would be a year before the church officers received word from Amsterdam. Finally, on April 3rd, 1680, Moy and Dorval wrote, "Now, praise God, the slaves are in Christian territory. To wit, Jan Peek is here in Amsterdam, Goose Stevenson and Jan Philipsop are at Livorno." They explained that the delay was because Peek cost 450 pieces of eight, which is what they had paid to Van Goor, but there was a difference of 22 pieces of eight from what Peek said he received and his ransom. Van Goor's correspondents in Livorno had to adjust their accounts for their negotiations. Stevenson and Philipson cost 1,066 pieces of eight, above Moy and Dorval's order, because the Jew who answered them had gone beyond his orders. Moreover, they noted that Seeken and Cornelis van der Veen had died in captivity. Peek carried this information to New York, ironically, aboard a vessel named the Susannah. 6 days later, Dorval and Moy wrote that Timothy van der Veen had arrived in Amsterdam, but that Philipson and Stevenson still remained at Livorno, because there was some disagreement about what had paid for their release. They nonetheless acquitted Adriano Van Goor of the 1,806 guilders, 18 stalvers, remaining of the 2,500 guilders they had given him for the captive's release in June 1679. In doing so, they promised to pay the additional 44 pieces of eight for the final release of Phillips and Stevenson, as well as some additional costs. The release of Phillips and Stevenson 3 years after the capture concluded the captivity of the Susannah's crew. 3 men had died in captivity, including Leisler's beloved stepson Cornelis. Stepson Timothy returned physically and mentally broken, the rest psychologically scarred. Leisler eventually secured his wife's inheritance through acrimonious legal suits. Out of this battle emerged the leaders of the factions for control of New York in 1689, when the Glorious Revolution in New York overthrew the Roman Catholic King James II's government and elected Leisler interim governor. The opposition did not hesitate to taunt Leisler about his enslavement. William Nichols sneered about what his Turkish education may have learned you. The opposition's frequent use of the term slavery and Turkish cruelties take on a different meaning when seen in this context. Ongoing research suggests that Jacob Leisler abandoned his involvement in the slave trade after his own harsh brush with enslavement. The Turkish captivity of the Susannah opens a small window into the complex 17th century Atlantic world. The New York City crewmen were fortunate. They carried passports. Many Europeans languished for years in captivity before being redeemed. Some without passports were sold into slavery or never lived to regain their freedom. The least fortunate were sold into sub-Saharan Mali, Sudan, where it was reported people use them as draft animals. On the other hand, virtually no Africans in the Americas, with a very few rare exceptions, were ever redeemed and returned to their homeland. Indeed, if the capture of the Susannah had impact on later political events in New York and on Leisler personally, it had absolutely no impact on the rapid codification of Black chattel slavery. The brutal restrictions placed on Africans and their progeny in New York increased with horrifying rapidity. The Jacob Leisler Institute's mission is to ensure that this story of the African diaspora in the middle colonies is told in full as well. But that tragic history is outside the scope of this presentation. Thank you.
So Dr. Voorhees, David, thank you very much for that lecture. And if anyone has questions that you would like to ask, I see a couple of questions already popping up. With a lot of information and a lot that was definitely new to me. So let me look at the questions and I can start. So someone has the question, what is the relationship of the North African kingdoms to the Ottoman Empire and how did that affect the captives?
Well, they were pretty much independent states. Excuse me, the kingdoms of Morocco and Algiers, but there was had suzerainty under the Ottoman Empire, and so one of the major aspects of their raids was to for the ransom money, to increase the money coming in.
Okay. And another question, did the captives have to wait for the furs to be sold before they could be released, or were there essentially bankers who acted on their behalf?
No, they had to wait until the funds were transferred. So
Wow.
the funds were raised in London, and then they were transferred to Amsterdam, and then from Amsterdam to Livorno, and then they were transferred to Algiers. So the payment was made in Algiers.
I think for me, one of the most interesting aspects is that this whole thing had an infrastructure to it. There were people who would, bring the ransom note. There were people who would come back and deal with the selling of the items and getting money and bringing it to, it was a business, but it was illegal. So the act itself of capturing someone was illegal, but there was a business that was carried on.
Well, it depends on what's, on whose perspective it was illegal. The Algerians think
That's
it
true.
was illegal, but
That's a good
the
point.
Europeans certainly did.
Okay. And then someone asked, you mentioned the New York church records, but what other sources did you use to follow this event of the capture of Leisler?
But there are records in the Amsterdam archives and Museum States Archive. There are records in
I'm sorry,
Albany.
where? I didn't hear the word.
Oh, in the city archives of Amsterdam, and there are records up in the Albany, uh, in the state archives.
Okay.
They're my major sources.
All right. And we commonly refer to the captors as Barbary pirates, but were they privateers or agents of the kings of the North African kingdoms?
They were they were they were agents of the government. I mean, we refer to them as pirates, but they just as a lot of what we call pirates had letters of marque from their governments in order to attack enemy ships. So they were agents of the government. They were.
Okay. And there's a question for me. Is it possible to rewatch this presentation? So it is being recorded, and as long as everything goes well with the recording, we will put it up on the our Hudson Area Library YouTube channel. We'll put a link on our website, and I can take the email of everyone who signed up for this event and send you an email with that link directly. So you will be able to rewatch this presentation. There's a lot of information in it, and the images were great also. Okay, and then there's a question. The British took control of New Amsterdam in 1664. Can you talk about the relationship between the Dutch and British at that time? Please explain the 1689 Battle of the Control on New York.
All right. Uh, in regard to the captivity, New York had been recaptured by the Dutch and had recently been again released. And so that the relief efforts were going simultaneously through both the English government, and it was the English government that the Algerians were dealing with as far as these particular captives were. And they carried English passports. So this is what's very important in their ability to get redeemed. The money was going through the Netherlands, through the Dutch Republic. And that's because most of the business connections remain still with the Dutch, in the Dutch Republic. Now it's very interesting. One of the ways that we're able to trace events so in such detail is because when Leisler sailed initially, he had to clear the port to pay taxes at Dover before proceeding on to the Netherlands. And my feeling is that he was on his way back to England after 3 months on the continent. So we're not exactly sure what he was doing on the continent. 100 years ago, a German scholar speculated that he was going to his brother's wedding, which was to occur in Basel, Switzerland, in 1678. But so far, I've not found out any evidence of that. The relationship to the revolution in 1689, the New York Rebellion was an outgrowth of the Glorious Revolution in England, which replaced James II with the Dutch Prince of Orange, William III on the throne. And there were rebellions in all the American colonies. And what's called Leisler's Rebellion was the uprising that took place here. The factionalism that developed really was centered on the split within the family between Mauritius Jansen's natural-born children who sided with Leisler and their relatives, and her stepsisters and their husbands and their relatives. They formed the core of the anti-Leislerian opposition. So they assumed the leadership within this rebellion between the two groups, contesting groups. There was distinct ideological differences. They were based on religion. They were based on patronage. And it gets very complex to try to explain all these differences. I'm focusing in this paper on the differences within the family over the estate fight, which was a very bitter feud because there was a considerable amount of property that was involved.
Okay, and also I should mention to people, there's another talk, I know we have a video of it, and I believe it is on our YouTube channel, of David speaking on the history of Jacob Leisler and New York. And I think, David, do we have the video of you speaking about the women, the Leislerian women and their...
You should have all my videos, yeah.
Yeah, I think that we do. So you know, if you go on that web page, you'll get more information. There's so much to just the study of this one man and how it goes out into the history of New York. So someone has a question also, what types of labor did the slaves perform? I know you mentioned that they were used, you know, for brute labor. Were they ever given jobs according to their class or their ability?
I think when it came to class, about the higher ransom that now you're speaking about the Algerines, right?
Yeah.
In the Barbary.
I think so.
They were looking for the highest ransom they could get, so they generally treated them not so harshly. But the average man was usually put to work on public projects such as building fortresses or working at the harbor. But the traffic in a lot of the traffic in the Ottoman Empire also was in the sex trade. So, for example, a lot of women were captured for harems. And the men would be used Also, as draft animals, as I mentioned, would be used for hard labor in quarries or in mines.
Mm.
It was very different because it's in a different economy than developed in the Americas. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was very particular.
yeah, so what was labor intensive in the North Africa and the Middle East is a very different situation than what you would have in a plantation economy in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay. Also, another person writes, it's interesting that the people in New York are aware of Leisler's captivity. How is this information being transmitted across the world? In letters, broadsheets, other publications?
It was mostly through letters. Now, there was also news that was carried by seamen as ships went back and forth. So there's a great difference between rumors, and I think that a lot of times that the news had to be verified in written letters or in official documents. We don't know. I don't know how Elsie Liza learned so quickly that he had been released. He was released probably in March, at some point in March, after March 3rd, but definitely before the beginning of April. And she knew at the end of July. So that is very rapid transfer of information. We still don't know how she received that information.
Mm.
The official word came with Governor Andros in August, the middle of August.
Okay.
And there's sometimes a long delay. It depends on shipping and wars, but sometimes news could be delayed for a year.
Mm. Okay. And I think you mentioned 1 million people over a certain period of time were actually captured.
This is, yeah, there are arguments about this. This is taken from a work that was published by Manning Davis in 2003. And we're talking about a 300-year period. So the amount of captives would vary by year. And it includes not just English or Dutch. It includes most of the raids were on the Italian coast, the Spanish coast, and the Aegean.
Okay. All right. So does anyone have any other questions? I think I went through all of them that are in the chat. I just got a new message. Okay. What efforts were made to stop the Corsairs if they were raiding Europe? Yeah.
Well, there were wars. It's not until the Barbary Wars, which is the first major international war that the United States was involved in, that the raids finally stopped.
Okay. Any other questions or comments anybody has? Okay. So I think we've come to the end of the questions. David, thank you so much for this lecture, and it is being recorded, so you will get a chance to hear it again if you would like. There's a lot of information, as I said, packed in. I know I'll be hearing it again. And other lectures by David and other people who've done through the Leisler Institute collaboration that we do at the library are on our website on the History Room page, as well as other lectures and programs that we've done here at the library, especially now that we do things virtually. Thank you all for attending. And I hope to see you next month, Thursday, February 25th, for a talk on the Underground Railroad in the areas of Troy and Albany. Take care, everybody.